Welcome everyone to Miss Wright's Read Aloud. We are continuing to read the story of Pax. When we last left off, we learned something kind of sad. So Gray, who was the older gray fox, was killed in an explosion that happened by the camp. And Pax had just gone back to Bristle and run into the mate of Gray to basically tell them what happened. And then he was returning down to that area because he was worried about what would happen to Peter if he ended up around something like that. Chapter 19. Bristle had started out after Pax, but his long bounds had outpaced hers, and he had run hard all through the night, all through the morning. He had not sensed her presence for hours when he reached the river in the front of the mill in the afternoon. He slipped silently into a stand of green reeds downstream from where Gray's body rested. He dipped his head to drink. When his thirst was slaked, he pushed the reeds aside. The field was empty. The vehicles were gone. There was no sign of the humans, but their scents were fresh and even sharper than before. They were nearby, and they were anxious. Pax climbed upstream and crossed the river at the narrows, then hurried along the treed ridge to observe the sight from above. New gouges raked across the hillside behind the mill ruins. Like a skulk of foxes taking to its dens, the soldiers had retreated to their trenches, a few still digging, others working on equipment, still others talking together over the charts. The vehicles rested behind the walls also. Pax retraced his steps back from the ridge, back across the river, back downstream. Again he slipped into the reeds, looking up from here. From there, he saw no humans this time either. The dark, electrical scent hung heavy in the air. The wind eddied, bearing smoke from the west. He'd smelled it twice on his way, but now it was thicker, more closer, dangerous. Pax could not wait until the safety of night. He dived into the water and swam with only his sleek head above the surface, climbing the bank, and shook the water from his fur. Keeping low, he headed for the closest cover, a scrub oak skirted with new suckers at its base, just a few bounds away. From here, he sighted the advantage he needed. Midway down the mill walls, where the field began to flatten out, a purple granite slab shouldered out of the ground. A bundle of wires trailed over this outcrop before dropping back into the grass. Pax crept out. His paws sensed a threat from the ground. More boxes were buried near the bank, and the field crossed with more wires. Leaping clear of the wires, he skimmed the grasses so swiftly they barely parted. At the base of the slab he flattened himself and perked his ears uphill. By the steady rhythms of their voices and tools, he knew that the soldiers had not moved from the trenches. The breeze was still downhill. It would alert him if they approached. He pulled a wire out and began to gnaw at it. Before he chewed through the sheathing, a fury of teeth attacked him from behind. He hit the rock hard, and the wind knocked out of him. He rolled to his feet and saw Bristle leap over to him from the crest of the slab. From that height, she held the advantage. The crows say the war-sick humans are nearing. This exploding earth, these death wires. Leave this for them to find. Pax was larger than Bristle, but he was no match for her determination. Every time he tried to reclaim his position at the wire, her snapping jaws held him away. He circled the outcrop, climbing closer to the mill than he liked, to come at her from above. But before he could pounce, A movement down at the river caught his eye. Bristle noted his alarm, but kept her gaze locked on Pax. The humans have arrived? Pax sensed an eager thrill below the question. No, another fox, I think. Bristle refused to be distracted. No fox from our valley would venture past the territory boundary. Pax rose on his haunches for a clearer view. He saw it again, a narrow copper wedge, tipped with white, that rose and disappeared, running beside the river bank along exactly the path he had taken earlier, the same path Bristle must have tracked to find him. At the reeds, another red flash. A small fox splashed into the water, and Pax recognized him. He shrieked a warning. Bristle turned to look then. Runt struggled out of the water beside the scrub oak. Instantly Bristle sprang up, seeming to double in size. In a single leap she cleared the ledge and flew back down the slope. No! Back! Home! Back! She flashed through the grasses. The panic in her voice seemed only to spur Runt on. He rose again to get her position and loped in the joyful bounds toward her. Pax pounced on the wire, but he was too late. Just as he stripped off the sheathing, a dark odor of lightning blew from the earth. A jolt of the current shattered one of his teeth. It seared his bottom lip, scorched his throat, and sizzled down his spine. And then a swath of the lower field exploded into the sky. Pax was knocked off the ledge, and he hit solid ground again. Tangled in uprooted shrubbery, the broken world went silent. His skull rang in the silence. He watched shock still as the storm of hot dirt and rocks and branches and weeds rained down upon him and wasted itself into a veil of grit. He staggered to his feet and sucked the burned air into his flattened lungs until his head cleared. Then he rose on his haunches to sniff for Russell and Runt. He tried for them in all directions, but his nose was useless, the fine scenting nerves numbed by ash and soot. He barked for them, but the ringing in his ears was still the only sound he heard. Pax worked his way out of the pile of brush and shook off the debris. Soldiers streamed down the hill across the smoking patch of field and then plunged into the river. When they passed, he followed. Each movement sent aftershocks through his bones. Where he had last seen them, he called again for Runt and Bristle. There was no answer, but, faintly at first, as if they were reaching his ears from a great distance away, he heard his own barks, and then the sound of the wind and the snapping of the seared weed stalks as he crashed through them, and the rough shouts of war-sick men as they returned to the trenches. And from the trees, a murder of crows cawing their displeasure at the ruined world. Pax could hear again. For an hour he paced the field, calling for the missing foxes. Dusk fell before he finally heard it, Bristle's weak answering yelp. He followed the call to the river's edge. There, the scrub oak was lying splintered and smoking over the bank, its blackened branches in the water. Pax found Bristle tucked into the earthly ball of its roots. Her head was up and her eyes were alert, although her muzzle was matted with blood. The fur of her beautiful brush was burned to a black crust. Pax nosed her face. The blood on her cheeks was not hers. She dropped her head. Curled beneath her was the still body of Runt. Pax dipped his head to the little fox's chest. It rose and fell in ragged hitches, and Pax was relieved. But then Bristle shifted and saw, where Hunt's hind leg should have been, where the neat black furred leg and the quick white paw should have been, there was only a shredded red mess in the blood-soaked leaves. Chapter 20. Peter rubbed the chisel handle with oiled steel wool, trying to resist the urge to throw it across the barn. The morning had been good. He'd crunched over the field and woods, through mud and gravel, up hills and down rock faces, over stone walls and under fences. Strong, tireless, and nearly as fast as he'd been with both boots on the ground. At noon, he'd told Vola he was ready to go now, and he was. But she had ignored him as usual. She ordered him into the barn to rest and taken his crutches hostage. Foot up, polish some tools. Get the hand feel of them. His gaze fell on the near-finished carving in front of him on the workbench. The fox was rough, but it looked alive, and it seemed to him a sign that he would find Pax unharmed. Although it was dangerous to hope, he allowed himself to imagine the scene. He would call for Pax at the spot where he'd left him, and Pax would come bursting out of the woods and probably knock him over in his happiness. They would go home together. "You're going to polish that handle right off, boy." Peter jumped. "I didn't hear you come in." "You can't go drifting off when you're working with tools." Vola settled herself on a barrel beside him and picked up a rasp and an oily cloth. "I was thinking about Pax." He put down the gleaming chisel and picked up his carving. He handed it over when Vola held out a palm. "Looks like he wants to jump out of my hand. You're worried about him?" Peter nodded. "But half the time I think he could be all right. Foxes are smart, really smart. We had to lock the door to the kitchen because Pax could open every cupboard. Once he chewed through the wire to a fan he'd just put in my room. My father was really mad. But then, when he was trying to fix it, he found out the fan had a short in the housing. It would have caught fire. I think Pax knew somehow that he was protecting me. So why wouldn't he be smart enough to learn how to hunt? Don't you think he could survive?" "I do," Vola agreed. Peter took the carving back and looked at the fox's face. "There's something else," he said. "It's that I would know if he died." And then he told Vola what he'd never told anyone else, about the merging he felt sometimes with Pax, how sometimes he didn't just know what his fox was feeling, but actually felt it himself. He held his breath, hearing how crazy that sounded. Instead of laughing, Vola told him he was lucky. You've experienced two, but not two." "That's on your board. Two, but not two. I didn't know what it meant." "It's a Buddhist concept. Non-duality. It's about oneness, about how things that seem to be separate are really connected to one another. There are no separations." Vola picked up his fox again. "This is not just a piece of wood. This is also the clouds that brought the rain, that watered the tree, and the birds that nestled in it, and the squirrels that fed on its nuts. It is also the food my grandfather fed me that made me strong enough to cut the tree, and the steel in the axe I used. And it's how you know your fox, which allowed you to carve him yesterday. And it's the story you will tell your children when you give this to them. All these things are separate, but also one. Inseparable. Do you see? Two, but not two. Inseparable. So, a couple nights ago, I was sure that Pax had eaten. I felt it. Last night, I saw the moon, and I knew Pax was seeing it right then too. Do you think if I feel Pax living, then he's alive?" "Yes." Peter's hope swelled at her words. Vola never said anything she didn't mean. "We tell the truth here. That's the rule," she told him about 100 times. It was a valuable thing, he suddenly realized, to have someone you could count on for honesty. How many times in his life had he wanted only that? How many questions had he needed an answer for and gotten instead from his father? Dark silence. And then, before he could chicken out, he asked the one that haunted him. "Do you think Do you think if someone had a wild part that it could ever be tamed out? If it's in his nature? Inherited? Vola looked at him hard. Peter knew she thought he was asking about Pax, and he didn't correct her. He picked up the chisel again and looked at it in his lap, his fingers squeezed white around the shank as he waited for the answer. You always been like this? Asking other people to figure out your stuff for you? Eh? That doesn't work. Peter let out his breath. As soon as he asked the question, he realized he probably didn't want to hear the answer. Maybe he would never be ready to hear the answer to that question. Vola patted her overall pocket and frowned. Almost forgot. She pulled out a napkin-wrapped muffin and handed it to Peter. He'd eaten 4 of them at breakfast, but she was always convinced that he wasn't eating enough. He unwrapped it. It was a little squashed, but as with the rest of them, the pecan was centered perfectly with the brown sugar topping. She'd stayed up late last night baking them, and he heard her singing something in a language he didn't recognize. Something happy. Vola, why are you still living out here alone? I told you. But 20 years to figure out who you are? I mean, how hard can it be? Plenty hard. The plain truth can be the hardest thing to see when it's about yourself. If you don't want to know the truth, you'll do anything to disguise it. Peter put the muffin down. She was avoiding his question. But you do. You know yourself. So how come you don't go live somewhere with people? Tell me the truth. That's the rule around here, right? She looked out the barn window for a minute. Her shoulders slumped. And when she turned to him, she looked tired. Fair enough, no bet, Peter. Maybe it's because I do know myself. Maybe what I know is that I don't belong with people. Maybe I am a grenade. What do you mean, a grenade? What would you call someone who can go from a girl eating peaches and watching fireflies to a woman who kills a man, eh? That girl would have her arm cut off before she'd hurt a single one of those fireflies. But a few years later, she killed a perfect stranger. I'd call that person a weapon. I'm unpredictable. I'm an unpredictable, deadly weapon. It's best if I stay hidden here, where no one will ever be hurt by me, even by accident. She raised her fingers and popped them at him. Boom! But this time the gesture looked sad, not menacing. You don't hurt me, Peter answered. How do you know I won't? Because I know, he thumped his chest. In my core. Vola slapped her palms around the workbench and pushed herself off. Put those tools back in the right order, she muttered over her shoulder as she left. From the window, Peter watched her stamp down the path. It seemed she was moving differently, as if the heart pine leg of hers had grown even heavier. One by one, Peter slid the clean tools onto their pockets and rolled out the canvas. He felt his old anxiety coiling at the base of his skull. Over a week he'd been stuck here. He would have left already if it hadn't been for the 3rd condition. He'd promised, and he still owed it to Vola, but when he'd asked her at breakfast about building the stage, she only shrugged. I'll get to it. Then the solution hit him, so ridiculously simple that he laughed out loud. Without his crutches, he was awkward and slow again, but he managed to hop outside to where Vola kept a brush pile. There he chose 12 long, straight saplings, each the thickness of his arm. One by one, he flung them into the barn doorway and then followed and slid them inside. On the sawhorses, he stripped them of their branches and set to work. 2 hours later, he had a stage. It wasn't much to look at. The corners raggedy notched and lashed with twine, mismatched scrap boards nailed onto a frame for the walls and floor. But when he strung a length of burlap over the top, he smiled. Piece of cake, he said to Francois, who wandered in and stopped to sniff the frame in obvious admiration. Piece of cake. I made the stage. It's in the barn. Vola looked up from the chicken she was plucking. She eyed the branch Peter was leaning on and then motioned to his crutches, propping them against the kitchen counter. Peter reached for them, slid them under his arms, and felt the immediate comfort they brought. I can do that puppet show for you now. Come to the barn. I have work to do now. But all right, tonight. And then I can leave, Vola. I'm ready. Vola laid the chicken on the table and sighed. You're not ready. You sleep indoors, dry and warm. You have clean water, and someone cooks food for you. But all right, tomorrow I will test you. 10 miles. You hike 5 miles. Show me you can make a camp on one leg, and hike 5 miles back. Then we'll talk. Peter watched her gather up the chicken feathers and tuck them into a pouch. And then it struck him. Nothing would change after he left. Vola would save her feathers, would make her puppets all alone in the woods, more and more and more of them, and tell that soldier's story to no one. Chapter 21. Pax watched Runt all night and into the day from a bush not far away. He left only to soothe his burned lip in the cooled river mud and make a meal of the small fish he'd found lying on the bank. His sense of smell returned, and whenever he woke from a fitful doze, he sniffed for Bristle and Runt to reassure himself that they were still alive. Bristle had dragged brush to the fallen tree to shelter her brother and curled her body over his to keep him warm. She left him briefly a few times, and when she did, Pax quietly took her place beside Runt's motionless form. He was there when Runt finally woke with a whimper. Pax nuzzled Runt's shoulder to comfort him. Runt lifted his head. His eyes were clouded in pain and fear. He cried out again, and Bristle, who had been hunting nearby, trotted back to him. Pax pulled back, respectful, but Bristle merely settled herself along her brother, her cheek beside his. Pax bent to Runt's wound and licked it cautiously, wary of Bristle's reaction. She watched him carefully, but did not object. Pax set to a thorough cleaning of the wound. Runt watched him with a trusting gaze and did not flinch. When Pax was finished, he cleaned Runt's face and ears, and Bristle allowed it. When Runt had fallen asleep again, Pax lay beside the two. Together, he and Bristle watched the activity of the camp. Although the humans did not return to the ruined part of the field, the scents were dangerous. When the wind was from the west, carrying the smell of burned land, the men seemed tense. More arrived at the camp, with more machines. At the sudden growl of an engine, Bristle jumped. She laid her head back over her brother's. I must move him soon. Humans cannot scent. If we are hidden from view, we are safe. Bristle looked from him to the men. We are not safe if a single human is nearby. Bristle seemed lessened to Pax, as if a vital piece of her had disappeared. He knew that somehow the humans had taken it. My boy does not bring harm. He is not like them. He is not war-sick. The war-sick are full-grown. He's still young. No, it is another difference. Pax was sure of this, but he was also confused. Over the past year, Peter had grown taller and stronger, and his voice had deepened. But more than that, his scent had changed. It was no longer the scent of a child. He is not young, but he is not war-sick. The last day I saw him, he cared for me, although he himself was in pain. His eyes shed water. His eyes were wounded? Pax thought for a moment about the mystery of crying. No, when he is hurt in other places, his eyes shed water. It streams down his face. I think the pain is relieved by the flowing water. But his breath, He gulps for air, as though this pain water may be drowning him. The vixen bent to lick more dried blood from her sleeping brother's haunch. After a while, she raised her gaze to Pax, and in it Pax saw the terrible things that had been done to her family by humans. And then Pax understood something. Peter had thrown the toy into the woods that last day. The pain water had been flowing from his eyes, but he had thrown the toy, and he had not followed. My boy is not war-sick, but he has changed. He is now false acting. Chapter 22. Peter lit the 4 big lanterns hanging from the barn rafters. The tools, the sharpening wheel, the wall of puppets, all glowed warm and cheerful in the cones of amber light. Even the hay shone like Rumpelstiltskin's gold. The barn looked reborn but familiar. He knew it like a home now. Home. As soon as he put on Vola's puppet show, just an hour from now, he would be finally free to start out again. He lit the 2 small lanterns near the stage and lifted Sinbad from the wall. Showtime! The marionette's black eyes looked back at him blankly. Peter checked the joints, still amazed that Vola had taken the puppet apart just so he could learn its secrets. And suddenly Vola's secret philosophy card flashed in his mind. I would have been a good teacher. She was right about that. He thought about how easily she suggested his drills without making it a big deal of anything. How she had him watch while she carved and let him figure out things for himself. How she asked him questions about everything and didn't answer for him. But she was all wrong about being too dangerous to be near people. Anyone who knew her would tell her that. The problem was no one knew her, except maybe him. He hung the marionette back on the wall. I think, Sinbad, I'm going to give you the night off. He went back outside and fished a wrist-length limb out of the brush pile. Back inside, he sawed off the ends and nailed on a base. He lashed the rock's tin bowl nest to the top of it and fixed it to the stage. Next, he lifted the sorceress puppet from its perch and unscrewed its left leg. Ready? Vola called out. Peter climbed the stack of hay bales he'd set up behind the stage and picked up the sorceress's controls, surprised his hands weren't shaking. Because suddenly, everything he was so sure of an hour ago now seemed like a terrible idea. When she'd come into the barn, Vola had been wearing a long purple skirt instead of her overalls, and she had combed her hair, something Peter had never seen before. She had been astounded at the stage he'd built, and it hadn't been an act. You have the makings of a woodworker, she'd said. If I were in the market for an apprentice, I'd offer you the spot. In another few minutes, what would she think of him? It was too late for second-guessing now, though. Ready, he lied. Vola turned down the 4 overhead lanterns. Then Peter heard her drag a stool in the middle of the barn. This is the story of a girl, he said. He heard Vola take a sharp breath. Then he didn't hear a sound after that. Not when he pulled the curtain and drew the sorceress from the plank. Not when the seed corn he piled up on her stomach like peaches spilled off. Not when he'd wrapped her in his camouflage t-shirt, tucked her hair into a clay bowl helmet, and slid the stick into her hand as a rifle. Not when he'd had her shoot the rifle, not when he'd unscrewed her leg, not when he made her climb to the nest. Peter had expected a protest when he lit the nest on fire, but still Vola didn't make a sound. And just as he'd predicted, the fire was only a momentary flare as a handful of wood shavings in the bowl flashed up. Just enough time for him to take off the marionette's army uniform. He drew her up out of the nest and eased her to the stage, where he'd propped the child puppet beside his carved fox. He had her bent low to the child, then turn and stroke the fox. And then he pulled the curtain. Peter hung the controls. He waited, but there was still only silence. He stretched to look over the stage. Vola stared straight ahead, right through him, her face as rigid as if it had been carved of wood. The tears streaming down her cheeks gleamed in the flickering light. Somehow they only served to make her look noble. "I'm sorry. I only meant... You're not a grenade. You're good. You took me in, and you're training me so I can get Pax..." "Leave me alone, boy." Her voice was low and wire-tight. "Wait. I think it's stupid to waste your life out here for some kind of punishment." Sorry. "Wait. I think it's stupid to waste your life out here for some kind of punishment. I mean, maybe that guy didn't even care about the book. Maybe he won it in a poker game the night before. Maybe what he cared about was, I don't know," Peter steeled himself, "being a teacher or something." At the word teacher, Vola shot her chin at him, but he didn't look away. "Yeah, maybe he wanted to be a teacher, so maybe you should go do that for him. But you'll never know, so I think you should go out and live your life. I'm just saying that whatever bad thing wrecked you before, you can start over like the phoenix and..." "I know what you're saying. You're not wrong, but get out of here now. Leave me be." Peter started to argue, but his words withered at the sight of her sitting so high, head so high, tears now rolling down her neck. He wrapped the sorceress's controls and then climbed down from the hay bales and picked up his crutches. The silence of the barn felt enormous. Okay, he said, just to break it. The walk to the cabin in the dark took forever. Inside, a covered plate rested on the counter. He slumped against the door frame, washed in guilt. Vola had made it up for him from the dinner leftovers. "You pick this chicken clean later tonight, you hear me?" A fresh wave of guilt. She'd killed a chicken, something she didn't do often, because she wanted him to have more protein. Peter shoved off from the doorframe and scooped up a box of matches beside the stove. He had no idea how long she'd stay out there, but when she came back, it wouldn't be to a cold, dark cabin. This much he could do for her. He lit all of the lamps and then laid a fire just the way he'd seen Vola do each night. Sitting there, watching it catch and grow, he replayed everything he'd said. It had all been true. Well, the part about that a soldier maybe wanted to be a teacher had probably pushed it. But who knew? Maybe he had. No, there wasn't a single thing he hadn't meant to say. Nothing he regretted. A gust blew down the chimney, threatening the fragile fire. He reached for another section of newspaper. As he crumpled it, the headline caught his eye. "Forces prepare to engage. Area to be evacuated." He flattened the sheet and read. He studied the map, unbelieving. And then he grabbed his crutches and pegged out to the porch so fast that Francois scrambled from his nest and shot out into the night. He jammed his clothes into his pack and looked around. The phoenix bracelet, the photo of his mother, and his mitt and ball were the only things of his in the room. He propped the bracelet on the hammock where Vola would find it, and dropped the other things into the pack, and swung up into the kitchen. Vola was just coming in. She hung her hat on the peg and looked over to the fire, then back at him, at his pack. He handed the newspaper to her. Vola scanned it, then looked up for an explanation. He pointed at the map. The area they're closing off? He choked. That's only 5 miles from where I left Pax. Are you sure? It's a big area. I'm sure. See this empty place? It's an abandoned rope mill. It's got all these high stone walls, and it sits overlooking the river at the only place you can cross it. The rest is gorge. That's where they'll start to fight the war. My friends and I used to play war at that mill. We said it was the perfect place for an ambush. We played war. I left Pax on the road leading up to it, thinking it would be... The word safe stuck in his throat. He shot up and lurched over the pegs at the door to grab his sweatshirt. Stop. They're preparing for battle there. Don't be crazy. It's not crazy. It's right. I know it now. Remember the cheese? You asked what kind I liked, and I didn't know. My father likes cheddar, so that's what we have. Maybe I used to like something else. It's like you said. I had the forgetting who you know disorder. Forgetting you know who you are disorder. I didn't remember what was right and what was wrong when I left Pax, but now I do. Now I need to go there. I know that. All right, maybe so. But you're still on one leg, boy. It isn't possible. Look at this distance. Vola sat down with the map. No, I've wasted enough time. I'm not listening any more. Hold on, Vola lifted the paper. You come over here. See something. Peter frowned, but he swung back over. Robert Johnson, the bus driver friend I've been telling you about, who's been mailing your letters. See this spot here? She tapped the top left corner of the map in the article. That town is the final stop on his route. He passes through there 11:10, Tuesdays and Saturdays, and this is where he pulls up at the end of the night. What if I put you on that bus tomorrow? Seems like that would save you at least 250 miles. Leave you about 40 to cover on your own. You listening now? Peter dropped his crutches and sank to the chair, jelly-legged with relief. You'd do that for me? Only 40 miles? That's nothing. No. 40 miles across woods and hills on crutches is not nothing. 3 days at least, I'd figure. It'll just about kill you. But I think you can do it. So you'll stay the night now. Deal? Peter took her hand and met her gaze. Deal. Looking at Vola, her face still tear-streaked from what had happened in the barn, he knew he couldn't leave things as broken as they were. And he didn't have much time to fix them either. Deal, he said again. On 3 conditions. That's it for today's Read Aloud. See you again. Bye-bye.